Gentlemen, today I spoke to Pete Jackson Main. He's an iridologist who has been in the game for a number of decades now. He's got multiple books out on the matter, and for those of you who don't know, iridology is the study of the iris, and you would be fascinated to see and hear how much you can know about your physical and your mental health just by looking into your eyes. We go at extensive depth into the topic today, looking at how Pete got into iridology, how his career has moved as he has gone through the trials and tribulations of multiple cancellations because of the information that he's putting out, and we start and finish on interesting grounds regarding how you can push this information into a useful space so that you can reap the rewards. I'm going to disclaim now that I didn't put the video footage with the video today because I didn't think it was particularly interesting. Pete wasn't in the studio with me today, and I thought just me sitting here didn't look that interesting. So what I want you to do with this is one of three things that I thought would be helpful. You can either stick this on late at night, watch the information, just have it as a bit of time at the end of the day, just to chill out. Or if you've got some tasks or something you got to do some chores, stick this on as some company. You can learn whilst you do some boring stuff. Or alternatively, put it on, enjoy the space, go for a walk, something like that, and just listen to the information. I really enjoyed having this space and talking to Pete, and I genuinely think even without the video, you will enjoy it as well. So with that being said, please like, please subscribe, do all of that jazz, but most importantly, enjoy. Right, in which case, should we get straight into it?
Why not?
Lovely stuff. Right, well, I'm gonna, as I said to you before we started, I'm gonna get into the bulk of the first half of the talk by talking about iridology, which of course is something that you're very well versed in as someone who's written multiple books. So first of all, practical iridology, using your eyes to pinpoint your health risks and your particular path to well-being. As the writer of this book, what is iridology in plain English?
It's actually the art and science, I would say, of making diagnostic pronouncements from looking at people's eyes. So it's the iris, of course, is what gives iridology or iridology its name, and the iris of the eye is the coloured part. And it's, you know, when we think about people and describe each other to each other, for example, we usually say, oh, he's got fair hair and blue eyes, or he's got dark skin and dark eyes, etc. So the eyes become a sort of an identifier in our minds when we're talking about people anyway. But if you look very deeply into that structure, you can see microscopic things that you won't see with the naked eye that have been found to be consistent with certain types of health problems. Not as absolute predictors, but as suggestions of risk factors, if I can say that. So rather than talking about diagnosis in the way that doctors do it, you have a bunch of symptoms and they say you've got X, Y, Z, whatever the pathology or the disease that they're naming might be. We're saying you've got things that point to the fact that you might, for example, have a genetic history, a family history that is, of certain issues. Things like diabetes come up quite often, things like heart problems come up quite often in that respect. But more than that, we're looking at the underlying causation of those problems. So we're looking at what has to go wrong before we actually get the disease. Now, I realise I've said quite a lot there. Is that simple enough?
I think...
Or does it need to be broken down?
Yeah, let's burrow into it, because if anyone's anything like me, then their brains aren't firing on the same wavelength as yours. I think the first thing that I'd like to go into with that is how you actually got into the field, because it's not something that is mainstream. Of course, the reason why I've had to get you to sort of break it down is for that very reason, because it's sort of a niche field. So how did you actually get into the study of the iris?
Yeah, I mean, it's a constitutional tale. I was at Cambridge University back in the 70s, and I still live in Cambridge, by the way. And I came out of university in a bit of a state, because I'd been, you know, like most students, doing things that probably I shouldn't have been doing, and pulling all-nighters to get my assignments in on time, etc., etc. Over-reliance on caffeine and tobacco, particularly.
Yeah, that's a familiar story.
And I was kind of looking for answers, and the GP wasn't giving them to me because I was just feeling rubbish. So a friend of mine pointed me in the direction of a practitioner who just started in the area, who was practicing herbal medicine, naturopathy, and iridology. And when I heard about it, I was immediately interested. I thought, well, let's check her out. So I went to see her. And long story short, she sort of turned around 3 years of rust in about 3 weeks, which I was very impressed by. In other words, I'd never felt better, really, after doing her program. And as part of that, she looked into my eyes and she told me a lot of things that I'd never even thought about, like whether my liver was working properly or whether my skin was discharging, properly through sweat, etc. And so I was sort of faced with a load of ideas about health that I'd never come across before, but which seemed intuitively helpful. And indeed, the results spoke for themselves. So at that point, having graduated in Cambridge with an arts degree, there were no jobs for people like me at the time. I was basically on the dole. But she suggested to me that it might be something that I could explore. And so I did. And that's where it all started.
So from that point, in which case, it sounds like, as with many of the sort of most pleasant parts of our life, we stumble our way into something that becomes absolutely profound.
Yeah, absolutely. You sort of somehow end up where you're supposed to be.
Yeah, exactly that.
I wasn't planning to go in that direction at all. I'm not science-based by inclination. I'm more of a sort of an arts-based, I'm a writer, I'm a musician. I've even done a degree in fine art, over the course of my life. So this sort of approach to health, I would have generally left it to the doctors. But in my case, the sort of medical interventions were not really satisfying. They weren't really doing the trick. And so I think from that alone, I was sort of motivated to find other answers.
I suppose you could say, though, to what you've just said there about sort of that creative element of yourself, that's exactly what's sort of come out there, is you haven't been getting what you're wanting out of the sort of conventional methods, and as a result, you've sought out something new. You've created a new sort of way of tackling the issue for yourself.
Absolutely. And interestingly enough, we're going to be talking a little bit later about sort of personality as seen through the eyes. And if you were to look at my eyes and understand them through that lens, so to speak, you realise that that's almost predicted in my iris pattern as well.
Which I think is a very interesting segue into the thing that I thought was particularly interesting here, is I want us to go over sort of the physical and the mental sort of telling signs of the iris, because I think they're both equally interesting. But the next question that I put forth was, what can our eyes tell us about our inner world?
I sometimes get, I'm sort of musing a little bit on this one, because when I think about my inner world, I have to sort of make an accommodation for the fact that inside and outside, it's very difficult to separate them sometimes. One's perspective on reality is always going to be subjective. But I think that this is where the personality side of it comes in, because, I can be very introspective. If you talk about the term introvert, for example, introvert or extrovert, I can also be extroverted as well. So it's not a sort of hard and fast diagnosis or definition. But I think when it comes down to, the things that one might think about, one's approach to the world, what floats one's boat. Do you know what I mean? Those things that sort of impel us to doing the things we want to do, or perhaps inform our responses to the world, i.e. to stress, for example. One of the things that the iris is very good at is determining in what way we habitually respond to stress and problems and challenges in life, and that can be very different from one person to another, and guided by the sort of internal dialogue, I suppose, that you might have with yourself. So I think there's quite a lot on that level. Generally, we call that behavioural. There's a whole sort of, I would call it an application within iridology, which we call behavioural iridology, which I have studied, and I've imported it to some extent into what I do, and into my own system, which we'll talk about later with the second book, where we're really looking at the personality the typical responses of a person, the way that they handle certain conflicts, for example, and the nature of those conflicts, where they come from, perhaps from our childhood or formative years, perhaps from somewhere else, I don't know. But the iris is a fairly reliable and fairly accurate representative of that kind of territory, the internal territory.
So why, in which case, I'm going to probe you in a way that might be somewhat controversial. Why do you think that this is such sort of borrowed information? This is not something that's put forth to the front of our intelligence. But of course, as you say, you speak of the fact that there's a great deal that we can sort of determine from the way that we look at our eyes. But of course, as I say, this stands still as a form of sort of niche practice. Why do you think that is?
I think there are two questions in there. One is, how does iridology work in that respect, and what's the sort of, explanatory mechanism at the heart of it,
yeah.
which is certainly something I can go into. And the other is what's almost like, why hasn't it hit the mainstream, for example? I.e., you call it niche, and I would agree it is niche. But why is it that it hasn't become more widely known and has become part of our cultural approach? And I think the answer to that is quite complex, and it goes into politics, actually. It goes into... I'll give you an example of that. For example, I think in 1941, the British, not the British Medical Association, it was the General Medical Council. Up to that time, doctors were routinely using iridology. It was a medical skill. It had been taught in medical schools. In 1941, the GMC decided that they no longer wanted doctors to use iridology in their practice, not because it was considered outdated or antiquated or ineffective or wrong, but because, in their words, it is not considered desirable to give patients the means of self-diagnosis. In other words, they felt it was a slightly dangerous practice, that people, if they got wind of it, that they could look in their eyes and diagnose themselves, they might, actually come to some harm, or diagnose themselves wrongly, or perhaps diagnose themselves correctly and not need doctors. Because actually, one of the things that comes, that comes into iridology is the idea of preventive healthcare. If you can see your risks ahead of time, you can take evasive action. And so, along with many other forms of what they call alternative and complementary medicine, I don't like those terms. I prefer to call it natural medicine or traditional medicine, actually. But in that kind of category, we are in a world at the moment that is down-regulating those techniques and those skills, and presenting contemporary standard medicine, biomedicine, as it's sometimes called, as the norm and the only valid medicine, scientific medicine, and anything else is sort of marginalized. We saw this very much during the pandemic. We saw, I was deplatformed 3 times for talking about herbal remedies for the immune system that would help us to resist the worst that COVID could do. And I was deplatformed not because I was giving people irresponsible advice. That was the sort of gloss that was put on it. I was deplatformed because they didn't want any alternative narratives to be put forward, because of the plan of the whole pandemic was working towards the vaccination program. And even the medics were hamstrung in that respect, because they were told not to use medicines that they had at their disposal, like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, for example. So it wasn't even just the alternatives that were sort of sidelined in that. And that tells you that there's a hell of a political charge connected with the way that the world deals with health. Most recently, of course, within the last few weeks, the World Health Organization has succeeded in passing their pandemic preparedness treaty, and 137 countries have signed up to it, which means basically that they're handing over the responsibility for dealing with a possible future pandemic to the WHO, to this centralized body, which, as we all know, is funded by people like the Gates Foundation. And you only have to look at pictures of Bill Gates, almost like, kind of waving syringes about to know what his agenda is. So I think that iridology suffered a lot in those stakes because, and they're always attempting to sort of say, well, there's no evidence for it. Interestingly, I can show you some really, really powerful evidence in favour of iridology, evidence that would pass muster in any scientific establishment, but it's not widely publicised, and in fact it's probably deliberately suppressed in many cases, but reputable universities have funded studies that have proved the effectiveness of iridology within certain very clearly defined parameters. So this is a case of, the reason why iridology is niche is because it's not been allowed to enter the mainstream. I think the most recent country to teach iridology to medical students is Russia, and they stopped in the year 2000, so not too long ago actually, but I know this because a couple of Russian doctors ended up in my classes because they could no longer get iridology teaching in Russia, so they came to the UK and they came to me. So, that's the answer to one part of your question, I think. The other part, what's the explanatory narrative, if you like, why do we think it works? I think the bulk of modern contemporary iridologists would agree that we're talking about genetics here. We're talking about a genetic footprint that the iris represents. So in other words, your DNA is your individual unique DNA is expressed throughout your body. It's expressed in every cell. It's expressed as the signature of DNA, but it's also expressed in the way your body develops, the look that you have, whether your hair, the colour of your hair, the colour of your eyes. And microscopically, if you look into the eyes, there's nobody on the planet with eyes that are identical to yours. They might be very similar, but they're not identical, and that can be demonstrated. And in fact, not so long ago, iridology was used as a bioidentifier for passport purposes and for access purposes. So we know that this is a highly individual structure, much more accurate, in fact, than fingerprints, about possibly up to 200 times more accurate than fingerprints in terms of bioidentification. So I think this is generally accepted as the way that iridology functions. And it's interesting, isn't it, that iridology is and has been accepted as a bioidentifier in certain circumstances for security purposes, passport control, etc., which is kind of interesting when you consider that they're at pains to point out to us that there's nothing really going on here, there's nothing to see here. Methinks they doth protest too much, to use the Shakespearean quote. If they're so keen to tell everybody that it doesn't work, why are they actually using it in other contexts?
Yes, it begs the question. And I think you've tied a very pretty bow on both of those points there, of the fact that it's very frequently not what is the most advantageous or sort of prosperous thing as much as the most profitable or politically charged thing.
Yeah.
And I love that. I think that's something that I'm very passionate about, that actually, as a sort of coming to terms with, and a lot of the time failing to, but at least trying to make people aware of the fact that it's not necessarily because something is sort of either outcasted or cast to the side in whatever fashion, be it putting it as a niche or just denigrating it, that doesn't mean that it is flat out worth sort of doing exactly that. I think a lot of the time people assume that those at the helm have their best interest at heart, and oftentimes that's not necessarily the case.
Not necessarily correct, indeed. Yeah.
And I like you illuminating that, and I think that was why I was so fascinated actually when I saw that you were an iridologist, to sort of go into this. Is why that was the real thing for me. Was I thought going into something that people may not have heard of, yet alone sort of know, is good. I think there's a real value in actually going into that. So with that being said, what I did want to go into was, what are some telling signs of a sort of, I'm gonna purposefully put this open-ended as to let you sort of poetically narrate your way through the point. What are some telling signs of sort of poor health when you look into the iris?
Okay, well, I'm going to break that one down immediately by saying that it used to be felt that signs in the iris were indicative of actual problems. It used to be regarded, in fact, there's a book out by an early German iridologist, which is actually called Disease Signs in the Iris. But I think this is a misunderstanding of the information that the iris presents us. We have the notion of constitution, which, by the way, is very similar to the way that homeopathy works. I don't know whether you've ever looked into that. And by the way,
just for the sake of that point, just in case, because I certainly haven't, could you go into that, please?
Constitution.
Homeopathy.
Homeopathy, yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, interestingly enough, the first ever iridologist was a homeopath. So you could say that iridology and homeopathy kind of grew up together, or that even that iridology arose out of homeopathy. And there are many concepts that it has in common, including the concept of constitution. Now, homeopathy, of course, is a system of medicine based on the fact that nothing can cure you. In other words, it's sort of often relegated to the notion of placebo. And when I say nothing can cure you, I don't mean you can't be cured, but a little drop of nothing is considered to be medicinal. And this has been proved, in high concentrated homeopathic medicines. It works the other way. In pharmacology, to concentrate a medicine means you get more in a smaller amount. In homeopathy, you get less in a bigger amount almost. So in other words, you dilute and dilute and dilute until there's literally nothing that can be scientifically detected, but it's the vibrational signature of the original substance that is retained in the water. And we all know that water is very good at retaining that kind of information. So homeopathy works on the basis that like cures like. So in other words, the remedies are chosen from substances that would cause a similar symptom if they were introduced in a macroscopic dose. But when introduced in a homeopathic dose, they actually stimulate the vital energy to sort the problem out. Okay. So one of the notions behind homeopathy is that we all have an individual constitution, and this in homeopathy is expressed in terms of what kind of remedy best suits you. So you might have, for example, a tubercular disposition or a psychotic constitution. And these are words which define the kind of diseases that might come out when your system gets unbalanced. And it's all about that notion of balance. In health, in balance, when the homeostasis of the body is working as it should, as it was designed to do, we shouldn't have a problem. But when something comes along and upsets it, everything goes, it's like a billiard ball thing. You shoot the white ball at the rest of the billiard balls. They scatter off in all directions, and anything can happen. And when you do that, the way in which those balls will play out, the knock-on effects, will be constitution. In other words, they'll be defined by your individual constitution. And we're looking at the same kind of thing in iridology. What we see in the iris is constitution, individualized constitution. And although I say it's individualized, there are some aspects of it that we share, like we share the majority of our DNA with each other. The bit that's different is a very, very small percentage, and it's the same in the iris. We can have a constitutional appearance in the iris that will be very, very similar from one person to the next, but it won't be identical. And it starts very, very simply. What's the first thing you would notice about somebody when you meet them? If you look them in the eye, you'd see the colour of their eyes. So colour becomes the first criterion of constitution. Then we have to look a little bit deeper. We need to look at the structure, and that's where it becomes a lot more individual. The iris is made up of a lot of fibres. They run from the centre to the border of the iris, so they run out in a radial pattern. And the precise course that those fibres take, whether are any interruptions, any holes in the texture, any thinning out of the fibre structure, those are also indicators of constitution. And then there are other signs that we might see as well, such as pigment signs, particular colours. And colours can be really interesting because they can point in the direction of particular organs. So yellow colours, for example, tend to point to the liver. Orange colours, interestingly, point to the pancreas, and so on and so forth. So we can start to actually put other colours into the mix, which are completely separate from the basic background colour of the iris. You either have blue eyes or you have brown eyes or you have something in between. Some people would say green, but green is in fact a mixture of blue and brown in various proportions. But those are the only true colours of the iris. But when you look closer, you can see other colours starting to come in that are what we call secondary pigmentations that are there to flag up certain other issues or possibilities within the constitution of that person. And the other thing about the iris is that we should have made clear right from the start, really, is that this isn't a case of I'm looking in your eyes and see how the iris has deteriorated in some way in response to your health conditions. Your iris, as it is set up, it's not actually fully formed at birth. The majority of the features of the iris will come in sort of from a week to maybe a couple of months into life, and so you won't see the full thing until maybe 4 months of life. So babies, when they come into the world, their irises are undifferentiated. They're just dark blue, all of them actually. Even if you're going to be brown later, you'll still start with a dark blue iris. And then some of that structure is completely set by the age of 6. That was one of the German researchers suggested, that the iris wasn't fully developed to the age of 6. I personally think the iris is not fully developed until the attainment of adult maturity, because I've seen, and many other people have seen, specific signs, particularly these little tiny little pigments that we sometimes call nevi, which is the anatomical name for moles, and we can see them arriving in the eyes of adolescents and people going through puberty. So it seems that there's another formative period in our lives where developments take place, but once there, they will not disappear. So what we're saying here is the iris is a remarkably stable structure, and it doesn't predict that you will be ill, but it tells you that if you get ill, what kind of illness you might have and how it got there. So rather than being an absolute diagnosis or a predictor of patterns of disease, it becomes almost like an operating manual which shows you how to adjust certain organs to avoid the possibility of getting ill. And that, I think, is a much more powerful method of diagnosis than simply putting a name on a disease.
So you take it from the perspective of prevention rather than sort of acting after the fact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that everybody should have an iris reading so they know what they're up against. But by the same token, if somebody is ill, what's more important is not to name the illness and then, give a suppressive medication to take away the symptom. It's more important to understand how the illness got there. And that's what really empowers me as a practitioner, as a naturopathic practitioner, as a herbalist, which are my treatment modalities. That empowers me to make clinical decisions that are targeted at the underlying dynamics of the disease and not just at the symptom.
Yeah, and see, that what you've touched on there is something that I was particularly interested when we first got on the phone. The thing that you said that really hooked me was this idea that medicine now is not with the intensive purpose of bettering as much as it is just getting you back up to some form of baseline.
Yeah.
And I loved that. I thought that was really telling of, because it's exactly the way it is.
It's a very, very political matter, because it's all about whether you're being productive or not. Whether you're generating the income for the GDP. It's on that level. In fact, there was a doctor who wrote a book about this in America. I think he called it The Politics of Medical Encounters. His name was Howard Waitskin, and he published a series of transcripts of GP consultations and proved by analysing those transcripts that what the doctor was there to do, functioning as an agent of the state, was to keep people in the job marketplace, to keep them working, keep them producing, make them productive. So rather than we used to have the idea of convalescence, for example. If you got ill, you had to spend time to get well again. Hardly anybody does that anymore. You take a pill, the symptom goes away, you're back into work. Yes, you dropped out of a heart attack a couple of years later, but do you know what I mean? It's that sort of putting a Band-Aid on it so that you can go on at all costs. And people have really assimilated that into the way they live. Just take the ordinary things like having a cold. Who stops for a cold anymore? Just take enough paracetamol, Lemsip, whatever your favourite version of it is, and you'll be able to carry on regardless. But there are some serious issues around that. Some serious issues not healing properly and not paying attention to the underlying dynamics.
Are you telling me that my government has more interest in money than they do in me?
Oh, never to be said. What do you think?
No, it does fascinate me to talk about that, though, because as someone, I mean, I'm going to go very armchair herbalist here, I suppose, and talk about the fact that I, as someone who has dabbled somewhat in psychedelics, can testify to the fact that there's a great deal of therapeutic use to be found in those medicines, but I would wage, on the same lines as what you're talking about here, that if someone was to have a handful of experiences at which point they feel as though they are much better equipped to sort of control their mind, that's not as good of a cost over a long term as 4 years of therapy is.
Oh, exactly. But also, it is going to make them a truckload of money as well. I mean, I've said somewhere, I've got another book coming out this year, actually, called Natural Healing, which is precisely about this and about, how do we heal properly and completely as opposed to just sort of masking the symptoms and carrying on regardless. And one of the things I have sort of exposed, I wasn't the first to do it by any means, is that what we do with the whole raft of the machinery deployed to research, produce, and market medicines. The research culture that we employ to do that as well. The ubiquitous randomised double-blinded placebo-controlled trial, which is the gold standard, which pharmaceutical medicines have to pass in order to be released onto the market. And then what happens when you've done that, and you could fudge the results. Pfizer, our wonderful Pfizer, who gave us the mRNA jab, of course, has been in court more times than any other pharmaceutical company for bad practice in this regard, for deceiving people, for fudging the research results, and so on and so forth. But that fudging, it never gets really stopped, because the results of that go into government policy in this country through an organisation called NICE, very inaptly named. And it all looks, at the end of the day, like someone's business plan for making a great deal of money off the back of our suffering, and also giving us, medicines that in fact will cause more problems than they solve. And this is the actual truth of what we're looking at here today. Now, I'm not a complete Luddite with this. I'm not sitting here saying, give up all your pharmaceuticals immediately and, demonstrate on the streets of Westminster. I'm not saying that. I'm saying make your choices. Make your choice about medicine. First of all, inform yourself about who you are and what your risks are, how your health is managed internally, how your homeostatic mechanisms work, whether they work efficiently or not. Make your decisions about your own health and then choose relevant medicines knowledgeably. And that's what I'm here to do, really. I'm here to teach people how to self-regulate where health is concerned, rather than running off to the doctor every time they have a symptom. I still have patients who do that. They seem to think that they can sort of somehow mix and match. And that works for a while too, while they're learning how to do that. But the real goal of this is that we have a population of people who don't need to feed into that monstrous machine in the way that's currently happening. So for me, it's about voting with your feet. It's for me, I haven't touched a pharmaceutical medicine for, I don't even know how long, decades probably, and it's all about, finding this is what happened to me. I was lucky because I was 22 when I found this. The encounter that I had, that I recounted earlier in our chat just now, happened when I was very young. I was just out of university, and that's given me a lot of time to, I didn't immediately stop seeing doctors. I didn't immediately give up the whole medical thing. I just gradually disentangled myself from it until I achieved a situation where I was pretty much independent of it, as I believe I am now. Touch wood, you know what I mean? Maybe I'll have a dreadful accident, and there are some, in the book, for example, in the new book, the Natural Healing book, I do go into this. When is it appropriate to see a doctor, and when isn't it? I mean, medicine can do some things that we can't do, certainly where trauma is concerned. Accidents and things like that are another case. But you see what I mean with general health, with immunity, for example, with the cardiovascular system, with digestion, and perhaps with hormones, more for women than men. We can do things very easily that will help to set those imbalances straight without necessarily resorting to any kind of pharmaceutical. We can do it through diet. You know, that's the original medicine. Ask Hippocrates, you know, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. And that's the kind of approach that we're trying to foster here is, you know, whatever that machine out there, however evil it might be perceived to be at some point, there's no point in sort of confronting it head on. It's much bigger than we are, but we can make choices in our own lives.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. As you say, I think if you try to go against the machine will crush you. But if you find that the sort of nooks and crannies within this where you can really get into that information that is genuinely valuable to you, and then, as you say, pick and choose where to sort of apply that, that's where you're winning, I suppose, on this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would like to burrow into, because I think it's something, I think a lot, this is like, as you said there, it's such a commonality. You said about the sort of, I've got a cold, I'm not feeling so well, I'm just going to dose up and carry on. Yeah. What should we be doing? If we're not feeling well, should we be, what should we be doing?
Well, I think the first thing is stop stuffing ourselves with, you know, foods that are actually going to block up the whole situation and suppress the life force. It's all about what we call the life force. It's vitalism, and scientists hate vitalism because it can't be measured. We can measure it in other ways. We can see it in the eyes. We can see it, you know, we can take the pulses as they do in traditional medicine systems. We can look at the tongue. We can make other assessments of vitality. We can even ask just random questions about it, you know, to find out how much energy someone's got. What we're talking about here is mobilizing the vitality of the body. When you come down with a cold, you might have a very slight fever. You notice a tickle in the back of the throat, which turns into a sore throat. You notice excess discharge through the nose, and then usually it sort of goes a little bit deeper down into the chest. You start coughing up phlegm, etc. All of these are natural mechanisms for clearing out rubbish from your body, for reacting to a perceived threat or invader. Now, I don't want to get too far into what a virus is, because I'm looking at that one very closely at the moment, and I'm not convinced they even exist, or that if they do, they may be something completely different from what we think they are. But any kind of force that invades the body, we could be talking about things that drop on us from the sky, things they put in the water. We could be talking about 5G radiation, you know, all of the stuff that we're talking about at the moment, some of us, as contributory factors to a wave of unwellness that has hit us in the last, well, it's been insidious, it's been building up for some time, but I think since COVID, which I think, by the way, I'm going to state quite openly, I think was a bioweapon. You know, it was deliberately released, or even if it was accidental, it doesn't really change the narrative that much. It was the result, ostensibly, of someone doing a lot of experimentation in a laboratory in Wuhan, in China, funded by the Americans, and who knows, possibly the British too, to devise novel ways of killing people, and it got out. And all of this stuff is in our atmosphere, so it does invade our bodies. What do our bodies do when they get this stuff inside them? Whether you call it a virus or heavy metal or whatever, what they do is, when it builds up to a significant proportion, they have a crisis. They have an eliminative crisis, which involves creating and expelling a lot of mucus, i.e. sneezing and coughing and spitting and the rest of it, and a fever, which of course is a biological mechanism for potentiating immune response. For every degree your temperature rises, your immune capacity can move around the body twice as fast, and that's exponential. So, a fever is an example of the body's self-healing mechanisms at work, and most symptoms are, in fact, examples of the self-healing mechanisms at work. And so when you feel like crap and you don't want to get up and go to work, etc., that's exactly what you should do. You should rest and let the body do what it does best. Now, we have this concept of specific immunity, which is learned immunity. Your immune cells learn to recognize a pathogen. They form, they generate or they form an antigen, which neutralizes or kills that pathogen. That's the basis of learned immunity, as we understand it at the moment. Now, it's been proved that your learned immunity will not work when there's too much cortisol in the body. In other words, those specific immune responses are suppressed during the day when you have to, your cortisol spikes first thing in the morning. You have to get up and do something, respond to the challenges of the day. That's when you need the cortisol. Then it sort of dips off and, goes on that curve downwards towards the evening. And at night, of course, you've got hardly any cortisol circulating at all. That's when your specific immune system gets up and says, right, now I'm going to do a bit of house cleaning, gets into the swing. Now, when you've got an actual threat, your specific immunity is kicking in, the worst thing you can do is to struggle on through it, because you're actively hobbling it. You're actively disabling your own immune system by doing that. So the thing to do is rest. Number one, drink plenty, don't eat too much, particularly not foods that are going to cause the digestion to work too hard. You want the energy in your immune system, you don't want it in the digestion. So eat lightly, if at all. Fasting is quite good. Herbal teas, my favourite blend for anybody who wants to knock a cold on the head pretty fast, actually, within a day or two, is yarrow, peppermint and elder, maybe a bit of ginger in there too. It's a diaphoretic tea, which means if you drink enough of it, it'll make you sweat buckets, and that's what you need to do because the body's trying to get rid of stuff. So sweating is an important part of it. So you just encourage your body and facilitate your body to do what it naturally wants to do, and you don't force yourself back to work and prematurely, because if you do that, you will interrupt the healing and the cleansing, the detoxing that is trying to take place.
Do you think we listen to our bodies enough?
No, but who are we? I try to. This has been my life path, to listen to my body and try and understand it, and that's what I do with my patients as well. I teach them to do the same, and hopefully they become somewhat proficient at it. It's easy. There are many inducements not to listen, inducements to forget, inducements to too busy. We all have financial realities to take care of. I'm no exception to that. I run 2, possibly 3 businesses with my partner, and that takes a lot of our time and attention. We're constantly on it. If you're self-employed, you will know that you're not the most benevolent employer in the world. You don't give yourself much time off, and so life can sort of get in the way of that. But above and beyond that, I do try to do the right thing by my body when it's giving me those kind of signals. And I guess that is a big part of how, in naturopathy, we have the idea that the doctor or the practitioner should actually be a teacher. In fact, the word doctor itself comes from a Latin word, docio, which means I teach. So part of the function of the doctor is actually to teach people how to live naturally in harmony with themselves, so that illnesses, when they come, and imbalances when they strike, don't become chronic. And that's the big thing. We can have an acute flare-up, and that's neither here nor there. We'll get over it, but it's when it gets chronic and things get set into the tissues and organs of the body, that's when we have to worry. That's when we're dealing with things like diabetes and heart disease and even cancer, I guess, when things have gone a little bit too far.
Right, in which case, I think I'm gonna do my best here to try and tie this bit on to the end of part 1 and sort of round out the iridology point before we start pushing forward with the next set, because I think we're sort of teetering that way, and I want to just round it out nicely and then make the move. So
yeah, absolutely.
For the sake of the point, if what do you think people need to know the most when it comes to iridology? What do you think is the most valuable lesson for people to take away from this?
The big lesson for me is a positive one. I am unique, and I am perfect in myself. And that sounds a little bit flaky, but it's in direct contrast to the idea that everything has to be about illness. Illness has a function in all our lives. If I'm ill, the most important piece of information that I could have is how to get well again. That's what we can see in the iris.
And with that, as I shall put your book into the description for the sake of that point, because I think we're going to struggle to get a whole book's worth of information in here. So we're going to plug that and push people in that direction. You've done a wonderful job of making the point there.